It's coming up to very nearly 10 minutes to 4 in the morning. One of the other things I want to talk about is the current credit problems, because apparently not just ordinary families and businesses are having difficulties in the credit crunch at the moment, but banks are actually getting affected by it as well, because people are no longer using their credit cards to borrow money, which is good news if you don't want to pay ridiculously high interest rates. But PricewaterhouseCoopers have just done a study in which they say that consumers unable to borrow from traditional lenders, including the credit card companies, are now seeking alternatives like payday loans and that kind of thing, the very short-term and very expensive way of borrowing money. Let's talk to Jonathan Davis now, who's a friend of the show. He's a chartered financial planner and always has an awful lot of interesting things to say about the state of the economy. Here's Jonathan. Jonathan, thank you very much indeed, as ever, for joining us on Talksport. We normally talk about the sort of shifting sands of the problems in the Eurozone, and we may get to those a little bit later on. But banks are finding themselves being kind of realigned in terms of consumer credit at the moment, I understand, as well. What's that all about?
Indeed, the Ernst & Young Item Club, which is a group of economic forecasters, are looking at lending to consumers and businesses this year, and they're forecasting that lending to businesses will be down by just over 2% this year, in total, and 5.7% down to businesses. So that, of course, will affect UK-based companies. It is unlikely to affect large multinationals. So, we entered into an era of deleveraging in 2008 with the collapse of the big corporations, AIG and Lehman Brothers, after an era of rising debt, of leveraging. Now, this deleveraging is going to last 20 or 30 years, because that's how long the rising debt took. And we saw, of course, what rising debt did to stocks and shares, to property, indeed to the public sector. Well, I can tell you, we're going to see the reverse for a long time in stocks and shares, in property, and the public sector.
And presumably that's bad news for all kinds of things, including the pensions market. It's bad news for manufacturing. It's bad news for jobs. It's pretty much bad news for everything, really, isn't it?
Pretty well everything. Certainly everything that most people have come to believe in, and that is the operative phrase. It's belief. It's not real. Is that asset prices can only rise. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. People are going to have to get real. They're going to have to get used to the concept that if there's less lending going on, then asset prices are going to fall. And as you say, that means that people will have less money in their pockets. They'll be spending less. Businesses will be making less profits. And that, of course, means less taxes, less public services, higher unemployment, and goodness knows what, I'm afraid to say.
I mean, we've been hearing for a couple of years now that lending is going to be much tighter and it's going to be very much more difficult to get a mortgage. And one thing I suppose that people who have got mortgages are happy about is that the interest rates are low enough that they can afford to keep making their monthly payments. But is there any sign that you're seeing that people are actually changing the way that they're living, if you like? Because an awful lot of people were living beyond their means. They were getting money thrown at them so that they could do that. I don't see any great evidence that people are becoming kind of less consumer-minded, do you?
No, not in the slightest. You're absolutely correct. They're in fact being forced to spend less. They're being forced to alter their behaviour, not because they want less debt, but because the banks themselves are insolvent, so they are themselves lending less out to both households and indeed to businesses. So it's not a voluntary change in behaviour, it's being forced upon them. And indeed what we're seeing, as I say, is rising unemployment because of this less spending. We're seeing the numbers of house sales down 50 to 60% because the mortgages are just not available, and the quote purchases, unquote, 1 in 2 of them is falling through. People still don't get it. They still believe that this old phrase, someone will do something, and it's not going to be themselves. Well, as I say, they're being forced into it.
And people are being forced into, it seems, kind of, I suppose, giving up on regular bank lending and ordinary credit cards and higher and higher levels of allowances and bigger kind of areas that they can spend money in, and instead they're going and looking for some of these short-term loans, it would seem. So they're not, rather than kind of cutting back on what they should be spending, they're just getting the loans from somewhere else. Is that going to bother the banks?
It's not going to bother the banks, because those payday loans, which are totally evil as far as I'm concerned, hundreds, if not thousands of % in interest, literally. It's a tiny, tiny market in relation to lending overall. However, for those borrowers who have gone down the payday route, I feel for them, because they're going to lose everything. That £1 or £2 or £4 or £500 that they borrowed is turning into thousands of pounds, and it's just crazy. And I'll tell you what, I would suggest to you that the vast majority of those folk who have gone down that route are not doing it to buy things that they want, but they're doing it to buy things that they need, like food and rent or mortgage and fuel. In other words, that's how bad the situation is for many folk in the UK today.
Now, you and I haven't spoken for a while, but there's been quite a lot of sort of interesting stories, if you like, coming out of the banking sector. We had Sir Fred Goodwin having his knighthood taken away. We had the conversation about Stephen Hester's bonuses, and now there are people in the railway network, in Network Rail, saying they're not going to take bonuses. I mean, have the people finally spoken and started imposing their will, if you like, on this bonus culture?
Yeah. It's certainly an interesting change in political mood. The politicians are listening to the Occupy London Stock Exchange type people, the people who are for the 99% against the 1%. However, it's a minor change in mood. It's not real. There's red herrings all over the place. While Hester's not taking his £1 million bonus, and as you say, Fred Goodwin has lost his knighthood, the bankers, for example, are still getting billions of pounds of bonuses this year. It's a load of red herrings which come out week after week in order to splash across the front pages, in order that the mainstream media news will put half of their news bulletins out about this item, when in fact it's totally missing the important points. The important point is that we're still subsidising the bankers to the tune of £100 billion a year. That's you and me, the taxpayers. And if only the politicians, and indeed the people, which comes really from the mainstream media, because the mainstream media tells the people what to think, as far as I can tell, if only the politicians and the media and the people would actually start for once focusing on the real issues. But no, I don't see that happening, and I don't see it happening for a long time to come.
And finally, what about the situation in Europe? It's kind of gone a little bit quiet recently. Cameron was over there again recently, sort of being one of two countries which was standing outside of this rescue treaty, if you like. It seems to be still bumbling on and stumbling on, but not really finding any kind of real solution at all yet, does it?
Well, it's certainly not gone quiet. You've got Greece, which has, for about the last 4 or 5 weeks, any day in the last 4 or 5 weeks, Greece could literally have gone bankrupt. And indeed, there's yet another meeting tomorrow. And, Greece will, to decide on that, and Greece will be the state or the government equivalent in 2012 of Lehman Brothers going under in 2008. The interesting thing is, of course, that once Greece goes, and there is no doubt whatsoever that Greece is going to go under, Then you've got Portugal, which is a bigger entity, and Spain, which is a bigger entity. Ireland is already gone. You've also got Hungary and Ukraine on the outskirts of Europe. Countries are going bust. A few years ago, it was bad enough, and it was companies. So no, nothing has gone quiet. In fact, it's just hotting up as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, Jonathan. Well, we'll no doubt be speaking to you again when it hots up sufficiently that everybody's taken a lot more notice of it. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
It's been my great pleasure. All the best.
Hawksby and Jacobs on Talksport.